you've established the frame, and we understand what it means to begin to think of the frame being broken by not showing up or maybe having trouble with pain. But the way that the therapist responds, the way the therapist begins to take in their responses to a situation like this also begins to touch on a theoretical bias, perhaps trope, maybe is a better word, pull, movement on the part of the therapist. And so I'm going to offer a conceptualization of psychoanalytic atmospheres, or the sense of the setting, from the British Object Relations School, which was founded on Freud, developed by Klein, added to by Winnicott and Meltzer, and and both early Bion, relating more to Klein, and later Bion, relating more to Winnicott. So I'm going to start with Freud. Freud established technical rules that first created the setting. The guiding principle concerns the state of mind of the analyst and analysand, the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, which is, the rule of giving equal notice to everything is the necessary counterpart to the demand made on the patient that he should communicate everything that occurs to him without criticism or selection. The rule for the doctor may be expressed: he should withhold all conscious influences from his capacity to attend and give himself over completely to his unconscious memory. So the goal is a state of radical openness, both to the patient's unconscious as well as the analyst's, which sounds remarkably contemporary these days. The openness to a process that occurs between two unconscious minds leads Freud to present two other facets of the setting. One is the couch, which may seem like a frame, but perhaps is more toward the setting, an atmosphere of abstinence that allows the patient to free associate without being trapped in the visual surface of social cues. Freud also famously said, analysts should, quote, model themselves on the surgeon, who concentrates his mental forces on the single aim of performing the operation as skillfully as possible. And then, what is often left out from that quote, he says that I dressed the wounds, but God cured him. That is, that the analyst interprets, but the patient's mind has to heal itself. And finally, Freud said, I require my patients to learn by personal experience. So Freud has a specific setting, that is an attitude and a way of making sense of perception, in which the two must mutually engage to reveal the patient's unconscious that is radically open to the potential emergence of what is hidden deep inside, without the intrusion of the analyst's needs and desires foreclosing the space. You can see that Freud, as the central precursor to Bion's innovation in learning from experience to suspend memory and desire. Further, Freud's idea balances his usually understood view of the countertransference. That is Freud's usual sense of the countertransference, the most classic sense, which is Freud saw it as something the analyst needed to be analyzed and kept out of the treatment room, not intruding on the patient's space. The modern countertransference movement, inaugurated by Paula Hyman, was built on the idea that the analyst's unconscious understands that of the patient. Herbert Rosenfeld also agrees with Hyman and quotes Freud when stating that working with primitive patients requires the analyst's capacity to use his countertransference as a kind of sensitive receiving set. Are you following me? Are you with me here? Do you have any questions so far? So this is pure Freud. Freud's classical and what seems in some ways oddly contemporary standard for the setting, the analyst's unconscious openness, analytic neutrality, that is, the analyst is not meant to impose but receive, and the patient's commitment to free associate as well as learn from one's own experience. It's all Freudian. So I move to Klein. Klein built her theory on Freud's two principles of mental functioning, pleasure and reality. In her conception, those two principles became fantasy with a PH and objectivity. Her technical procedure tightened the frame and the setting as she focused entirely on the analyst's role of making interpretations about everything taking place between the analyst and analysand. She felt everything the patient said was a free association, which now, under her theoretical point of view, becomes a broader concept. Her frame became the total situation, past and present, which represented the patient's primary objects and so became an interpretive focus. This lens broadened Freud's idea of transference and expanded the idea of the setting, that everything said is transference. In Klein's theory, the fantasy world of the internal objects are given free play. She expanded the idea of the superego from the internalization of the parents' union to both part and whole object relations in their loved and hated aspects. These additions made it even more important for the analyst to remain neutral, so that the internal objects had the full stage of the analytic frame and setting. This is a space of separateness, and therefore of weaning, to help the patient see and develop their own mind. It is meant to be objective, but it is often felt to leave out attachment. Tolerating absence and separation creates this objective setting, which is non-gratifying. It takes up positive and negative aspects and requires the analyst to not enter the patient's system subjectively, but to remain objective in the face of the tangle of the idealized and persecuting projections into the figure of the analyst. This led often to a caricature of Kleinian work as devoid of feeling. Winnicott offered an alternative. He says that with some patients, the setting becomes more important than the interpretation. He feels that in some patients, a primary integration never took place, and so the patients lack foundational basics. They develop false selves resulting from early impingement that requires the nascent self to put up a false version to satisfy the environment, resulting in a loss of going on being. It is this setting that creates a specialized state wherein the patient can feel unimpinged. Winnicott feels the psyche can only start in a certain setting. This setting must be one in which the patient can regress to an unintegrated state, and development can be restarted. This is not a neutral space, but has a trope or a pull toward provision of a holding, safe place, much like that of an infant who cannot survive without the mother, and is meant to be a creative dependence. It is a subjective space. This is in contrast to Klein's objective space, on which is projected, idealized, and persecutory figures. The setting then began to expand with Bion. Bion, who was informed by Klein. Bion, of course, worked with Siegel and Herbert Rosenfeld in the early days of the British Object Relations School. Bion expanded his work to incorporate the previous three stances that I've outlined, as well as some new ideas. The first new idea is his container-contained, and the second is his transformations in O. O standing for raw, unknown experience, and differing from transformations in K, thought about and known experience. So already Bion is beginning to move from just interpretation to transformation, transformations that take place from raw unknown experience rather than from a kind of understanding in the analyst. He added to Klein's projective identification. For Klein, projective identification got rid of intolerable feelings and parts of the self and intruded them into the object. Bion expanded this idea to include normal degrees of projective identification, where the infant is not intruding but attempting to communicate with the mother. The analyst then must act as a container and detoxify them, a state he calls maternal reverie. Bion expands on Freud's dream work to say the analyst needs to dream the analysand's material to facilitate mental digestion. So no longer is there a stance like Klein, where she's objectively trying to perceive projected objects, both idealized and negative, idealized and persecutory, but there is a sense of receiving something emotional, trying to digest it and return it, mildly transformed. It's a much more Bionian idea than a Freudian or Kleinian idea, although Freud's idea of just unconscious receptivity certainly figures in here as we made that link between Freud's idea of receptivity and Bion's no memory and desire. The transformative process transitions from knowing about to becoming real, emphasizing the moment of experience, especially one in which one would usually attempt, the subject, the patient would usually attempt to get rid of the emotion. For Bion, insight is supplanted by the need to unearth central emotional experience. And it's important to add a bit about Jim Grotstein as well as Thomas Ogden here, early and significant followers of Bion. Grotstein says the analytic project involves establishing the analytic setting and atmosphere and maintaining the frame as the analytic covenant, as an agreement to protect the third, which is an Ogden concept. Ogden and Grotstein were great friends. They talked together all the time. But Ogden wrote about the third in this way. Not the third as in the Oedipal third, but the analytic third, that is, the co-created object of the work together. And this becomes a matrix of intersubjectivity, ushering in Bionian field theory, which puts the analyst as a subject in the analysand's mind, and material reality begins to be ignored. It becomes more about two subjects interacting. This development is very different then from the early sense of, and this is sort of my general point, is that